Here we are in video 2 about how to make a knockoff. I showed you how to make the pattern in the last video, but we don't yet know if there's enough fabric to actually make this blouse. So, does the pattern fit on the skirt? No. There's no way I'm going to get this whole blouse out of this skirt. But I have a solution. I'm going to cut the arm's eye facings out of black cotton pocketing and the undercollar and one of the collar stands too. So now that I have a plan, I can disassemble the skirt. I'm cutting the waistband off first, and then cutting off the seams. Sometimes I'll remove the stitches from the seams if I desperately need that little bit of fabric that I could get out of the seam allowance. I've already washed the skirt a few times, ironed it, and got the seams nice and flat before cutting. Now I can really lay the pattern out and see what I'm working with. For the front pieces, I'm lining my fabric grain line up to the pattern. This fabric is slippery and goes off grain easily, so I'm lining it up as close to perfect as I can get it. The collar stand will have to have a seam at the back, so I'm adding seam allowance to my pieces now before cutting them out. I stitched the center back seam of the collar stand and pressed it open. Then I trimmed the seam allowance away where the other seams will be so it doesn't end up so bulky. Now for the interfacing. I tested a few pieces of tricot interfacing to see how it folds. If you run the interfacing through a seam, it's going to be stronger, but if you trim the interfacing away right at the edge of a seam, the fold will sometimes be more crisp. I think this fabric performs better without interfacing in the seams, so I'm going to use carbon tracing paper and a tracing wheel to mark out the collar and collar stand on the tricot interfacing. There are different kinds of tracing wheels which can be confusing. I'm using the tracing wheel on the right to mark the transfer paper, but when I'm marking pattern paper, I use the needle point tracing wheel on the left. I cut the interfacing just shy of the seam line. I also cut 7/8 inch strips for the center front placket. Before I fused the pieces, I used the pattern to reshape the fabric. Then I centered the interfacing and fused it. At the center front, I folded the seam allowance over the interfacing, then folded again at the other edge of the interfacing, which is the front of the blouse. This is how I'll shape the front plackets, which is where the buttons and buttonholes go. I'm pinning that in place and sewing at 7/8 of an inch. Then I can press it flat. Now I want to mark out the darts, so I'm drawing lines with a friction marker from the point of the dart to the notches. Then pin, making sure both sides are lined up correctly. To sew them, I'm starting at the side seam, back tacking, and then sewing to the point. I'm ending the dart right at the edge of the fold, but don't back tack. Instead, leave long thread tails and use a pin to tie them into a knot at the base of the dart. Then, thread the tails through a needle and run them back into the dart to hide them. To press the dart, first I press it in half just up to the point. Then I fold it down and press over a ham to get a smooth curve. Next, I want to serge the shoulders and side seams of the blouse and the facings. Then serge the raw edge of the facings. I pinned together the front and back at the shoulders and side seams and tried it on. It looks good, so I can sew those seams, and then press them open. I also pin the arm's eye facings at the shoulder and side seams, and then stitch those too. Then press those seams open. Now I'll put together the collar. I mark the 1/2 inch seam allowance at the undercollar, then pin it to the collar. It doesn't exactly fit because I want the collar to fold over the undercollar. I'm sewing the seam, and instead of pivoting at the point, I'm stopping a stitch shy of the point. Then pivot and sew 1 or 2 small stitches across the point. Believe it or not, this will help them be pointier because it reduces the amount of seam allowance in that point. Then pivot again and continue sewing, making sure to ease the collar fabric into the smaller undercollar. You can see there's a bubble of fabric at the collar points. That's great. Now I need to trim away the seam allowance at the front edges of the points down to just a few threads away from the stitch line, and snip at the curves of the collar. I pressed the seams toward the undercollar where I could, and then turned it right side out. The points are so pointy, I'm using a metal rod to try and push them out. I also very carefully use a pin to pull the points out. Once I get them as pointy as they'll go, I press the collar flat at the edges. See how the floral fabric hangs over the black undercollar just a bit? That's why you trim away the undercollar. It still doesn't quite match up at the edge, which is good. The undercollar is a bit shorter, which will let it fold smoothly under the collar when it folds. I'm pinning the collar edges together and then pinning it to the collar stand. I'm lining up the collar edge to the notch at the stitch line, not at the edge of the fabric. Then sew the seam just shy of a ½ inch. On the collar stand lining, I'm marking the ½ inch seam allowance at the bottom, then folding and pressing it up. Once it's pressed neatly in place, I can trim it down to a ¼ inch. I'm using carbon tracing paper and a tracing wheel to mark the stitch line at the front collar stand curve. Then I can pin it to the collar and collar stand and sew at a ½ inch, covering the previous stitch line. I like to trim away the seam allowance at the curve instead of snipping it. Then grade the seam allowance, which means to trim each one at a different length. The seam allowance that backs up to the self fabric should be the longest. Then each one is shorter after that, to kind of taper it. I'm pinning the collar stand to the bodice. I like to push the seam allowance out of the way for this part so I can sew right up to the edge of the placket. This is really hard to line up, and you might have to redo it a few times until it's lined up just right. The seam allowances should all fold back smoothly in line with the edge of the placket. Snip the seam allowance of the bodice at the neck so it doesn't constrain the collar stand. Then use a ham to press the seam open, then up into the collar stand. Now grade the seams. Then pin the inner collar stand in place over the seam. Don't be afraid to use a ton of pins. Now I can stitch along the edge of the collar stand starting at the upper center back and catch the lower edge of the collar stand lining. With the collar done, I'm pinning the arm's eye facings in place. I sewed them first with a ¼ inch seam allowance, but it was too small, so I went ahead and stitched it again at a ½ inch. Then snip the curves and serge the edge. Understitch the seam allowance onto the facings, and press with the self fabric hanging over just a little bit. You can tack the facing to the bodice at the shoulders and side seams, but since my fabric has a nice weave, I'm going to hand sew it down all the way around the edge. I pin the facing down and I'm sewing from inside, folding the facing back and loosely stitching through just 1 or 2 yards of the fabric. To do the hem, I'm making a quick stitch at a ¼ inch from the bottom. This helps me press the edge up and over again. Then I can sew it down. One more good press and that's done. Now is my least favorite part for some reason, buttonholes. These are 4-hole buttons, and the skull button at the top is a shank button. I'm eyeballing approximately where I want the buttons to go, then using a sewing gauge to mark the spacing more accurately with pins. I used a scrap piece of fabric to test the buttonhole on my home sewing machine, and I'm marking out the center and end points for the buttonholes. Then I let my home machine do the work for me. I trim the threads and then use a small rotary cutter to cut open the buttonholes, and a small scissor to get into the edges. Then I mark the placement of the buttons and use my home machine to sew them in place. This weird looking foot is a button foot. I disengage the feed dogs, set a short zigzag stitch, then use the hand wheel to crank it and make sure the needle doesn't hit the button. When it's safe, you can run a few stitches in each direction of the buttonholes. I left long tails from the machine and pulled the threads to the back. Then I thread them through a needle and sew them into the back of the placket to hide them. The last thing to do is hand sew the skull button in place. And there it is, a blouse made from a skirt using the pattern from another blouse, all of which were found at thrift stores. Talk about upcycling! Before you run off to your closet to grab your favorite shirt to knock off, don't forget to like these videos and subscribe to my channel to see more exciting sewing projects and tutorials. Up next, I'm going to do a quick summer dress using a McCall's pattern.